Well, she has quite a career at her young age. How can you end up being an officer in the Naval Reserve? You have worked with the U.S. State Department, have been the spokesperson there. You have a deep background in our foreign policy, and you bring all that to bear every single day as you talk to people around the globe about U.S. policies and positions as a contributor for Fox News. And that is our guest today, Morgan Ortagus. Morgan, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We're thrilled to have you. And we're hearing so much from Tennesseans right now about their concerns over what is happening with China, what is happening with Russia, Iran, and I'll throw in the fourth member of what I call the new axis of evil, North Korea. Those four countries do comprise that. And as I talked with Tennesseans during our holiday break, one of the things that was not lost on me is that while so many things have made them angry and they have such deep concerns about domestic policy and inflation, and they're really worried about those things, what frightens them is what they see happening on the global stage with the Biden administration. So as we look at Russia and Ukraine, I'd love to get your insights on what is happening there, why Putin is so emboldened, and what U.S. policy should be to address it.
Well, that is a lot to take on. I will do my best. I would say, I think one of the reasons, one of the people that, the person that we can give credit to for Tennesseans being concerned about China and understanding the implications of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the world is President Trump. And if it wasn't for President Trump in 2015 sounding the alarm about China, you would not have seen the shift in Washington, the focus from both parties on the Chinese Communist Party if it wasn't for him waking everyone up. And I think that that is one of the most underreported stories of what he did to change the global dynamics, the global balance of power, and something that I think historians will look at quite closely. So when we look at all of these flashpoints around the world, it certainly makes me nervous to have a president who I have disagreed with on almost every major foreign policy decision, like a former Secretary of Defense once said about him, and a vice president with zero foreign policy experience. And she almost runs away from the foreign policy, portfolios, like things at the border that she's supposed to take on. So it should be concerning because I don't think that we have the strength in the White House from the president or the vice president that we had in the last administration. So when it relates to Russia and Ukraine, it's interesting. Senator, what did we hear for 4 years? Russia, Russia, Russia. Trump wasn't doing enough to stand up for Ukraine. All of these things. Well, let me tell you one thing that didn't happen under President Trump and under Mike Pompeo, who I worked for at the State Department in the Trump administration. What didn't happen is Russia invading its neighbors, is Russia trying to amass troops on the border to look at potentially re-invading Ukraine. So what happened? If you look back in the Obama administration and President Obama's second term, Russia went in and invaded Crimea. Now, if you go and look, if you do a quick little Google search, if our friends in Tennessee do this, they will find out that coincidentally, the same Obama administration officials who were in charge then are in charge now. And so I think it's quite interesting that when Putin decides to be aggressive with his neighbors, to potentially invade his neighbors, the last time it happened, it came again at during the Obama administration. Now, they did invade Georgia in 2008 when President Bush was leaving office. So it's happened under both administrations. But I think it should not be surprising to anyone that it didn't happen for the 4 years that President Trump was in charge, because I think they understand and respect strength despite all the rhetoric from Washington.
Well, and one of the things that we see really affecting foreign policy is Biden's weakness and Blinken's weakness. And when that is compared to the strength that was displayed by Secretary Pompeo and President Trump, And you see such an imbalance there. You know, Morgan, I think that's one of the things that makes people nervous because they see this penchant coming from Xi Jinping and from
Hmm.
Vladimir Putin and from the Iranians writ large to push forward and try to
Yeah.
expand their territory, expand their reach. And in the case of the Chinese, they're practicing debt diplomacy, they're pushing the Belt and Road, they're moving forward with great power competition. They know no end.
Hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think, listen, I've always said that the issue of dealing with the Chinese Communist Party and their global ambitions to change the world order in their favor is not a partisan issue. It can't be. It's too big of an issue. So I am trying as best as I can to encourage the Biden administration when I think they're making the right decisions on China, and standing up to them. But, there's some things that are worrying. There's two things that happened at the beginning of the Biden administration that made me worry right away. One is, as soon as we left office, China decided to sanction many former Trump administration officials, including my former boss secretary, Mike Pompeo. Now, I don't think Mike Pompeo is losing any sleep over that, but China did it for the purpose of punishing people who were China hawks, who were tough on them in the Trump administration. No one in the Biden administration stood up for the people who came before them. And I think it sent a very loud signal to Biden administration officials. If you are tough on China, then when you leave office, the Chinese will sanction you and try to prevent you from being, on the board of any international companies that do business in China. And so it was very concerning to me that they weren't standing up for the people who were in the positions just a few weeks before. I mean, that seems like a simple thing to do, to stand up for your fellow Americans against what is America's biggest challenge as it relates to a nation state. The other thing that happened, Senator, the second thing that happened is, if you'll remember early on, Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan went to, I believe it was Alaska, to meet with the Chinese for their first face-to-face meeting. And the press was in the room. They were having the normal 2 minutes, right, where the press catches the back and forth between both countries' leaders. And in those 2 minutes, what was supposed to be 2 minutes, the Chinese leadership decided to berate Secretary Blinken and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, berate them publicly, talk about all the bad things America had done. And it was really shocking. And I do think, to the best of his ability, Blinken tried to stand up for himself and for America. But the fact that it even happened was very telling to me. I had a few reporters that texted me that said, what would Mike Pompeo have done if the Chinese had did this to him in front of the media? And I said, well, they wouldn't have done it. They wouldn't have tried him. They just knew what would have happened if they did. And Mike Pompeo would have rained holy hell down on them if they had tried to do that. So it was funny. Just yesterday, I was on with the Nixon Library with Mike Pompeo, Robert O'Brien, and many national security officials from the Trump administration at state, DOD, at the NSC. And we were all talking about, Russia and Ukraine. And I've often, and Senator, you and I have talked about this before, I strongly believe that we often overcomplicate foreign policy because we have this foreign policy elite, whatever the hell that means, in Washington, that try and make decisions for the rest of Americans. And we use these big words, and we talk about countries, that are intimidating to people. Maybe they've never been to them and they don't know much about them. But it really doesn't have to be intimidating. It's very simple. My toddler, this is just an analogy, her dad, my husband, was away last night. When I went to put her to bed, she threw a fit. Why did she throw a fit? Because she knows that mom feels guilty and will take her out of the crib and give her a few more minutes, to watch a little Coco Melon before she goes back to bed, right? My toddler does this to me and not her dad because she knows she can get away with it to mama. However, the same thing applies for Putin or any other thug around the world. Why is Putin trying to potentially invade Ukraine or get concessions from the US and Europe now? It's simple, because he knows he can. This is just human nature. You push, especially an autocrat, especially a thug like Putin, you push and you get away with as much as you can think you can get away with, depending on who is in charge and who is in power in the American administration.
Well, that's very true. And we all remember that Barack Obama sent blankets and meals ready to eat to
That's
Ukraine
right.
when he was president. and Donald Trump sent them bombs and bullets. And there's a
That's
big
right.
difference in how they treated and dealt with Russia. There's a big difference in how the Trump administration dealt with China and Xi Jinping, and keeping the pressure on China and on our allies. Huawei is a great example of that. When we talk about cyber, and putting them on a list so that they could not be doing business with our government, with our military. And of course, we see the Biden administration trying to relax policies. Let me ask you this. The Olympics are coming up. Do you think our athletes should attend or not?
I struggle with this one. I really do. On one hand, I appreciate the diplomatic boycott that the Biden administration put forward. I think, to just back up, I think that we should have thought about this a year or two ago, and we've known that the Olympics are going to be in China for a long time. We all know there's an ongoing genocide there in Xinjiang. You're talking about forced abortions, forced birth control, forced marriage even between Uyghur women and Han Chinese men. So we know all this is going on. It's not a surprise. We probably should have made alternate plans, but we didn't. And we probably should have coordinated better with the allies, but we didn't. So I do think that the diplomatic boycott is a first step. I do not think American corporations, and they're private corporations, so free to do what they want, but I do not think that they should be sponsoring and advocating for these Olympics. I do struggle with not giving our athletes, and some of these people have worked their entire lives to go to the Olympics. And so I struggle with not giving them the ability to compete on the world stage. And so that's where I think an entire boycott's a little tough for me, just because I don't want to punish the athletes. Saying this, I think that if you're watching this program, you're thinking about going to China to view the Olympics, to be a spectator, I would caution you and urge you against that. It's not just the ongoing genocide in Xinjiang. It's also, there's a massive COVID problem there. We all know, number one, that they have lied and continue to obfuscate and hide the origins of COVID-19. Lord only knows how many variants there and how many actual cases they have. They don't report, right? Let me just say one thing as a little aside. When you're on the news, and you see people saying like, oh, America has the highest number of reported cases in the world. Well, that's because the other countries lie, right? The Chinese and the Iranians, for example, and God knows who else, they're not reporting the truth. Yes, we have the most cases out of truthful countries who actually report, what we're coming in. Anyway, as an aside, so I think you have to be, if you're thinking about going as a spectator, I would caution you against it. The Chinese are not above taking people, for ransom or for political gains. I actually wrote about this at CNN of all places a couple months ago. So I want to honor our athletes, but NBC News should be very careful in how they broadcast this. No one should be under any illusions of what's happening, an ongoing genocide in Xinjiang, China against Muslims. Christians are still persecuted, by the way. There might not be an ongoing genocide, but the Christians are still very much persecuted in China. And of course, I think you have to be careful from a COVID perspective. You just don't know what's happening there, and you're not getting the truth.
That is so very true. And the persecution that is carried out, the genocide that is carried out, the way they've treated the Hong Kong freedom fighters, the Tibetans, the Mongolians, the list goes on and on, the way they are bullying Taiwan at this point. And, you're right. We should have had the American Freedom Games so that the athletes are not punished. Corporations ought not to be sponsoring this. Our news outlets should not be over there reporting and glorifying this and glorifying Xi Jinping. So we're going to keep a close watch on that. Well, Morgan Ortagus, I am so delighted that you are now a Tennessean. I
love it.
That you call Tennessee home, and our Unmuted with Marsha audience can keep up with you on Twitter at Morgan Ortagus. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Senator.